Frost has a memory. It remembers how deep it reached last year, and the year before, and the year before that. It remembers the mild winters when it barely touched 4 feet, and the hard winters when it pushed past 6. And every few decades, in winters that old-timers speak of in hushed voices, Frost remembers how to reach depths that younger generations have never seen, depths that make ordinary preparations into death sentences and careful planning into catastrophic failure. The settlers who came to Minnesota in the 1870s brought their knowledge of winter from gentler places. They came from Germany and Scandinavia and the eastern states, from climates where frost might reach 3 or 4 feet in a hard winter, where a root cellar dug to 6 feet was considered more than adequate, where the rules of thumb passed down from fathers and grandfathers had proven reliable for generations. They applied these rules to Minnesota without adjustment, without considering that this new land might have its own rules, its own memories, its own capacity for cold that exceeded anything their ancestors had prepared them for. Niels Erikson came from Finland, from a village north of the Arctic Circle, where the sun disappeared for 2 months every winter, and the cold reached depths that killed anyone who did not take it seriously. He had seen winters that froze the ground to 20 feet. He had seen root cellars that were dug deep enough fail anyway, because deep enough in Finland was not the same as deep enough everywhere else. He had learned, before he was old enough to shave, that the only margin of safety that mattered was the margin between the deepest the frost could reach and the depth at which you stored your food. When he bought land in Minnesota in 1878, he looked at the soil and the latitude and the weather patterns, and he calculated what the frost might do in the worst winter this land could produce. Not the average winter, not the typical winter. The worst winter, the one that came every 20 or 30 years, the one that the people currently living here had never seen because they had not been here long enough to see it. His calculation said the frost could reach 12 feet, maybe 14 in the absolute worst case. The other settlers were digging cellars to 6 feet because 6 feet had always been enough in the places they came from. Niels decided to dig to 18. The digging began in the summer of 1879, after the spring planting was done and before the fall harvest demanded attention. Niels worked alone at first, cutting through topsoil and clay and rock with the patient determination of a man who knew exactly why he was working so hard. Kirsty helped when she could spare time from the garden and the animals and the 1,000 other tasks that homesteading required. Together, foot by foot, they carved a hole into the Minnesota earth that their neighbors found increasingly absurd. Bernard Schultz was the first to comment. He was German, prosperous, established on good land that he had been farming for 15 years, and he considered himself an authority on how things should be done in this part of Minnesota. He stopped his wagon on the road one August afternoon and watched Niels haul another bucket of earth from a hole that was already 12 feet deep and showed no sign of stopping. "Erikson," Schultz called out, his accent thickening the way it always did when he was preparing to deliver wisdom to someone he considered inferior. "How deep do you intend to dig that cellar?" Niels set down his bucket and looked up at the prosperous German farmer. 18 feet, he said. Schultz laughed, a loud barking sound that carried across the fields. 18 feet for a root cellar. I have farmed here for 15 years, Erikson. My cellar is 6 feet deep, and my vegetables have never frozen. 6 feet is sufficient. 6 feet is what sensible men dig. 18 feet is the work of a man who does not understand this land. You have been here 15 years, Niels agreed. I have been watching winter for 47. Your 15 winters have been mild. The hard one is coming. When it comes, 6 feet will not be enough." Schultz shook his head with the satisfied certainty of a man who knew he was right. "You Finns think you understand cold better than anyone. But this is America, not Finland. The rules are different here. You are wasting your summer digging a hole you do not need." He drove on, and Niels returned to digging, because arguing with confident men accomplished nothing. The frost would argue for him. The winter would make his case in ways that no words could match. The cellar reached 18 feet by late September. Niels lined the walls with stone, fitted together without mortar in the Finnish style, creating a structure that would hold back the earth for generations. He built wooden stairs descending in a spiral to save space, installed shelves along every wall, constructed bins for root vegetables, and platforms for barrels of preserved food. The cellar could hold enough to feed a family of 6 for 2 years if necessary, stored at a depth where the temperature would hold steady around 40 degrees, regardless of what the surface was doing. His neighbors watched the construction with reactions ranging from amusement to concern. Some laughed at the Finn who dug 3 times deeper than necessary. Others worried that he was showing signs of the obsessive behavior that sometimes afflicted immigrants who could not adjust to their new country. A few, the ones who had also come from places where winter was serious, watched with quiet interest and wondered if perhaps Eriksson knew something they had forgotten. Everyone who laughed was about to stop laughing. If you want to see how 18 feet became the difference between eating and starving, subscribe to Winter Whispers and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The winter of 1880 began early and announced its intentions immediately. Snow fell in October, which was not unusual. The temperature dropped below 0 in November, which was uncomfortable but not unprecedented. But December brought cold that the established settlers had never experienced, cold that dropped to 30 below and stayed there, cold that turned breath to ice crystals before it left the mouth, cold that killed livestock caught outside and froze pipes that had never frozen before. The frost began its descent into the earth. It moved slowly at first, an inch or 2 per day, following the cold that penetrated from above. By Christmas, it had reached 3 feet across most of the territory. By New Year's, it had passed 4 feet. By mid-January, when the cold had persisted for over a month without relief, the frost line was approaching 6 feet, the depth that everyone had agreed was more than sufficient for root cellar construction. Bernard Schultz discovered the problem on January 18th. He descended into his 6-foot cellar to retrieve potatoes for dinner and found frost crystals forming on the bins. The temperature in the cellar, which should have been holding steady in the high 30s, had dropped to 31 degrees. His vegetables were beginning to freeze. He worked through the night, moving what he could to the warmest part of the cellar, piling blankets over bins, burning a small fire in a metal pan to raise the temperature. By morning, he had saved perhaps half of his stored food. The rest was frozen, the cellular structure destroyed, the vegetables converted from nutrition into compost that would rot as soon as it thawed. Other families discovered similar disasters over the following days. The Hendersons, whose cellar was only 5 feet deep, lost everything. The Muellers, who had dug to 6.5 feet, lost 2/3. The Carlsons, the Petersons, the Olsons, family after family opened their cellar doors and found frost where food should have been, ice where vegetables should have been stored. The work of an entire growing season destroyed by cold that had reached deeper than any cold they had experienced before. The frost line passed 8 feet by the end of January. It passed 10 feet by mid-February. It reached 12 feet in the first week of March, the deepest penetration anyone in the territory had ever measured, cold sinking into the earth like a blade pressing slowly through flesh. Niels Eriksson's cellar held at 39 degrees. The temperature wavered slightly as the frost passed through the soil 6 feet above, dropped a degree when the frost reached 10 feet, stabilized as the cold reached its maximum depth and found itself still 6 feet short of the stored food. The potatoes stayed firm. The carrots stayed crisp. The cabbages and turnips and beets and everything else Niels and Kirsty had preserved through the summer maintained their quality at a depth where the killing frost could not reach. The word spread through the settlement the way that news of survival always spreads in times of crisis. The Finn cellar has not frozen. The Finn still has food. The Finn dug deeper than everyone said was necessary, and his deeper turned out to be exactly the depth required to survive a winter that exceeded every standard of preparation. The first families came in late February, after the frost had destroyed their stores and before the spring thaw made travel impossible. They came with empty baskets and desperate eyes, asking if perhaps Niels could spare some vegetables, if perhaps he had enough to share, if perhaps he would not let their children starve because their parents had dug cellars to the depth that 15 years of experience said was sufficient. Niels shared. He calculated what he and Kirsty needed to survive until spring, added a margin for uncertainty, and gave away everything else. He did not charge money. He did not demand future payment. He simply handed over potatoes and carrots and cabbages to families whose preparation had failed through no fault of their own, except trusting experience that was not long enough. Bernard Schultz came on March 3rd. He came alone, driving his wagon through snow that was finally beginning to soften, his face showing the particular shame of a man who must ask for help from someone he publicly mocked. He pulled into Niels's yard and sat on the wagon seat for a long moment before climbing down, as if gathering courage for what he had to do. "Eriksson," he said. His voice was hoarse, stripped of the confidence that had characterized every pronouncement he had made about proper cellar depth. "I have come to ask if you have food to spare. My stores are destroyed. My family has been eating seed grain for 2 weeks. If we continue, we will have nothing to plant in spring. If we stop, we will starve before spring arrives." Niels looked at him, the man who had called his digging the work of a man who did not understand this land, the man who had assured everyone that 6 feet was sufficient, because 6 feet had always been sufficient for him. The man who had laughed at 18 feet and called it excessive. "Come," Niels said, "I will show you what excessive looks like." He led Schultz to the cellar entrance and down the wooden stairs that spiraled into the earth. They descended past the frost line that had destroyed every shallow cellar in the territory, past the 8-foot mark where the Hendersons' food had frozen, past the 10-foot mark where the cold had reached its maximum power, past 12 feet where the frost finally exhausted itself, down to 18 feet where the temperature held steady and the air smelled of earth and preservation and survival. The shelves were less full than they had been in autumn. Niels had already given away half of his stores to families whose cellars had failed, but what remained was impressive. Bins still holding potatoes and root vegetables, jars still sealed and unfrozen, barrels of preserved cabbage that would provide nutrition for weeks to come. Schultz stood in the cellar and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The 18 feet of depth that he had called wasteful had become the margin between his family eating and his family starving. The extra 12 feet of digging that he had mocked as obsessive had preserved food that was now keeping his neighbors alive. "How did you know?" Schultz finally asked. His voice was barely above a whisper. "How did you know the frost would reach so deep?" "I did not know this winter would be the one," Niels said. "I only knew that a winter like this was possible. In Finland, we have a saying, 'Dig for the worst winter you can imagine, then dig 2 feet more. Your grandchildren will thank you for the extra work.'" Schultz absorbed this in silence. He had spent 15 years in Minnesota, believing he understood its winters. He had spent 15 years building confidence on a foundation of experience that was too short to show him what the land could do. Now he stood in a cellar dug by a man with 47 years of watching winter, and he understood that experience without depth was just luck waiting to run out. "I have seed grain," Niels said, "enough to spare some for planting, and vegetables to last your family until the ground thaws. Take what you need. You can repay me with labor when the work begins again." Schultz took what he needed. He loaded his wagon with potatoes and carrots and seed grain, enough to keep his family fed and give them something to plant when spring finally arrived. He drove away without further conversation, because further conversation would have required acknowledging things that his pride was not yet ready to acknowledge. The winter broke in late March. The frost began retreating from the depths it had reached, the ground slowly warming from below as the sun's increasing strength warmed it from above. By April, the top few feet had thawed enough to work. By May, the damage was visible everywhere. Cellars whose walls had cracked from frost heaving, bins whose contents had become unrecognizable masses of frozen and thawed decay, the infrastructure of food storage destroyed across half the territory. Niels spent that summer teaching. He walked his neighbors through the construction of deeper cellars, explaining the Finnish techniques for shoring walls at depth, demonstrating how to line excavations with stone that would hold for generations. He did not lecture or gloat or remind anyone of what they had said about his own digging. He simply shared knowledge that his grandfather had shared with his father, knowledge that generations of Finnish farmers had accumulated through winters far worse than anything Minnesota could produce. By autumn of 1880, 11 families in the settlement had cellars dug to 15 feet or deeper. By the autumn of 1881, the number had doubled. The practice spread to neighboring settlements, carried by word of mouth from families who had survived the winter on vegetables from an 18-foot hole that everyone had called excessive. Bernard Schultz dug his new cellar to 16 feet. He worked through the summer of 1880 with a determination that surprised everyone who knew him, hiring help when his own strength was not sufficient, pushing deeper than anyone except Niels had gone. When neighbors asked why 16 feet when 12 would probably be enough, he gave the same answer every time. "The Finn taught me that experience only counts if it is long enough to see the worst. My 15 years showed me normal. His 47 years showed him the extremes. I am digging for the extreme now, not the normal. My grandchildren will thank me for the extra work." The winter of 1880 to 81 was mild. The frost barely reached 4 feet. The deep cellars were unnecessary, the extra effort apparently wasted, the cautious preparation looking foolish to people whose memories were short. Some of the settlers who had dug deep in the panic after the previous winter began to wonder if they had overreacted, if the extreme cold had been a fluke, if they could return to shallow cellars now that the crisis had passed. Niels said nothing to these doubts. He knew that memory was short and that confidence rebuilt quickly after disaster. He knew that some people would fill in their deep cellars and return to 6 feet because 6 feet was easier and cheaper and had been sufficient in their limited experience. He knew that the next extreme winter would teach the same lesson all over again, to a new generation that had not been alive to learn it the first time. The extreme returned in 1899, 19 years later. The frost reached 11 feet that winter, destroying every cellar shallower than 12 feet, wiping out the food stores of families who had decided that deep digging was excessive and that normal preparation was sufficient. The families with deep cellars, the ones who had maintained what Niels taught or what their parents had learned from him, survived without loss. The contrast was as stark as it had been in 1880. The lesson as clear, the question of whether to dig for normal or extreme, answered yet again by frost that did not care about opinions. Niels Erikson died in the spring of 1903 at the age of 71. He died in the cabin he had built in 1878, with Kirsty beside him and their children and grandchildren gathered from across the territory. He was buried on the hill behind the homestead, next to the cellar entrance that led down 18 feet into the earth, the cellar that had kept his family fed through the worst winters Minnesota could produce. The cellar still exists. The stone walls that Niels laid in 1879 still hold back the earth. The wooden stairs have been replaced twice, the shelves rebuilt 3 times, but the excavation itself is unchanged. 18 feet of depth that represents one man's understanding of what winter could do and one family's determination to survive it. There is no plaque at the cellar entrance. Niels never wanted monuments or memorials. He wanted survival, and he built for survival, and the survival speaks for itself every time someone descends those stairs and feels the temperature drop from whatever the surface is doing to the steady 40 degrees that 18 feet of earth provides. His great-granddaughter gives tours sometimes when visitors come to see the cellar that saved a settlement. She takes them down the spiral stairs and shows them the bins where vegetables were stored, the shelves where jars of preserved food waited for winter, the depth markers that Niels carved into the stone wall showing how far down they had come. She tells them about the winter of 1880, about the frost that reached 12 feet, about the families who came with empty baskets and left with food because one man had dug deeper than anyone said was necessary. The question, she tells visitors as they stand at the bottom of the stairs, is never whether the extreme winter will come. The question is only when. Her great-grandfather understood that. He dug for when, not for if. And when the frost came deeper than anyone expected, his family ate while others starved. If this story taught you something about preparing for the worst winter, not the average one, subscribe to Winter Whispers. We have more forgotten knowledge that kept people alive when nothing else could. And tell me in the comments, what would you dig deeper to protect? 18 feet, 12 feet of frost, 6 feet of margin. That is the arithmetic of survival when winter decides to show what it can really do.